Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Timeline Astrology Podcast. This is Gary, and this is all about the August 2025 sidereal transits. So, August is definitely a mixed bag of a month. There are a lot of oppositions, so planets in opposite signs. But there's also a conjunction between Venus and Jupiter, which I think is going to be enjoyable, but perhaps maybe too enjoyable, and we might overindulge because of those oppositions. In other words, if you're feeling stressed, if you have a lot of tension, you're more likely to have a bit more of an indulgence in something just to relieve that tension, but that could then add to further stressors. So that's also because Venus and Jupiter coming together are in a square to the main opposition that's impacting August, which is Mars and Saturn. Mars and Saturn is probably one of the more conflicted oppositions and general aspects in astrology anyway. Mars and Saturn do not get along. They, in a way, work for each other in another way because Mars is exalted in Saturn's sign. So Mars is a sort of young, youthful energy and go-getter kind of impulse is always better in a sort of environment that's more cautious and focused and disciplined. So Mars is better off by being held back in a way. It doesn't really work the other way though, with Saturn being about caution and restraint and responsibility and feeling pushed into something. Oftentimes we're not at our best when we feel pushed and impatient. So that's something to be mindful of in August. It's likely to feel a bit tense at very least. And obviously, we're going to see this in the world more, especially, but in our own personal lives, we have to consider how this impacts our personal charts and how do we deal with this. I think the best way to deal with this is to focus the energy, to get really focused on something, on doing something without being too rigid about it also, because the key thing here is, of course, that Mars is in Virgo, sidereal Virgo, and that's typically very precise, but it's opposite Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, which are both retrograde in Pisces, and that feels a lot less precise. And so it's kind of like trying to be precise when the target keeps moving. That's kind of what it's probably going to feel like. So I would keep an open mind about whatever you're doing and try not to get impatient if it's not working out exactly as you plan. At the same time, we have a Mercury retrograde until August 11th, and that's adding to the complexity in a way and the need for patience, and likely, though, adding to the sense of frustration with Mars and Virgo opposite Saturn. So, this is, I guess, a month of two halves, like most months are essentially, and especially because the sun moves sidereal signs mid-month. So, it always feels like a bit of a month of two halves. But this one, more especially because of Mercury retrograde and those oppositions. And by the latter half of the month, things are kind of ironing out somewhat in terms of the details, but then we have some other things going on I'm going to talk about in a minute. As a reminder, I do go through more in-depth astrology for patrons. I go through a sign-by-sign forecast, so you can follow your sign, as well as a in-depth written report if you want to follow along. It's only $5 a month. Go to patreon.com/timeline astrology. But for now, I'm just going to go through again the main transits. And one of those actually is in the beginning of the month, and it might not be something that you're aware of even as it's happening. And that is Mars is transiting the eclipse degree, even though the eclipse hasn't even happened yet. So on August 4th, Mars will be at 4 degrees of sidereal Virgo. Therefore, Mars is activating the eclipse already before the eclipse on September 21st. So that's a trigger. Now, as soon as Mars moved into Virgo, it set off the tsunami, which is interesting because that's a very Mars in Virgo opposite Saturn, Neptune, and Pisces. And it's also a reflection of this sort of like, needing to go a different direction. It's like if you're told to get to higher ground, for example, you had plans for that day to go somewhere. Well, no, the ocean had another plan for you. That's again, and in a way, a metaphor of what this opposition is about for all of us. Like you might have very particular plans about where you want to go and what you want to do. And then there's this thing that you cannot avoid. You're adding now in an eclipse with Mars transiting the eclipse degree, and this is now triggering something unexpected you hadn't accounted for. And Virgo is very much about taking account and taking stock and being very clear about the details. And again, with this eclipse being triggered, with Mercury being retrograde and all the oppositions, things are just not clear right now. So again, why in the beginning of August, you really do have to be very patient, I would say. After that trigger of the eclipse, and it could be so many different triggers in the world, of course, we're seeing so many with the economy, with lots of things going on. We have this lead up to the full moon. I think a really important full moon on August 9th. August 9th, we see a full moon in Saturn sign, Capricorn, conjunct Pluto, which is opposite Mercury retrograde. And at the time, we have Mars exactly opposite Saturn by degree, which means Mars is also opposite Neptune by degree. This is the sort of like major, like something big blowing up, something massive, and maybe something also being resolved, but it's likely to bring something to a head, essentially, this August 9th full moon. Again, opposite Mercury retrograde, and Mercury a couple of days after the full moon on August 11th will station to go direct. So it's a real tense point where our mind is probably full and it's probably going to feel full on. And we're feeling the anticipation and excitement also maybe about things starting to move forward again and we can start to plan ahead. But that tension, again, it depends on how you deal with tension. Some people just might not want to deal with it and again, just enjoy the Venus Jupiter thing. But some people might use this, take it on board, be very exacting or I guess as exacting as you can be while being open-minded about the outcomes and get a lot done. That's the potential here in the beginning of August, leading up to, again to that full moon on August 9th. And after that, then things can start to resolve and start to iron out, especially, like I said, then as Mercury starts to move forward from the 11th. Now, August 11th is also the day that Venus and Jupiter come together by exact degree in Mercury's other sign, Gemini. So this is also a bit of a mixed bag, though, because Venus and Jupiter haven't got the same objectives. And so, although this might be seen as quite a positive, fortunate, lucky even transit, it's also quite troublesome. And, there's different approaches to this in terms of whether it's Western astrology or Indian astrology. Western astrology typically sees this conjunction as fortunate, Indian as not so. But as always, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. It's likely to be enjoyable, obviously. It's Venus and Jupiter in Gemini. The the issue is again that they have very different objectives. Venus is all about enjoyment for sure, but Jupiter isn't. Jupiter is not in a favorable position for itself. Venus is quite happy here. It's just popped in from next door, from Taurus, its own sign, and it's enjoyable for Venus. It's in a friendly environment and it likes pleasure seeking and stimulation and busyness and activity and all of that. Jupiter is as far away from Sagittarius as it can be. So it's not at home. It's just not enjoyable for Jupiter, which wants more meaning and purpose and depth. And apart from that, Jupiter practically represents what is the right thing to do. And when it's in Gemini, it's very hard to decipher what's the right thing to do because it's too busy, like mentally. And apart from that, more practically, if we think about Jupiter representing the law, you know, one delineation I've come up with around this is that this is like Jupiter in Gemini is like this playing around, quote unquote, that's Gemini, playing around with the law, playing around with laws, changing laws, kind of twisting them and turning them to, suit, this flip-flopping as well in terms of what's going on in the US with trade wars. Back and forth, back and forth. This is an expression of Jupiter in Gemini, also in a square to Saturn and Neptune. You tend to see this like with people now becoming jaded and sort of disillusioned with the whole thing. And it's quite a clever tactic in a way by Donald Trump, but it's also, again, in our own lives, how do we manage this? That's the key thing. How do we manage this sort of back and forth? And we're wanting to be clear about things, but it's hard to be clear about things when the goalposts keep changing, and we want to be inspired and do something meaningful. But there's always this enjoyment aspect coming in that it's like that can so easily derail us from what we need to be doing and what is the right thing to do. So quite again complex, even though enjoyable. But when you throw that into the mix of the Mars-Saturn opposition, which is exact around the full moon on August 9th, and then again the Venus-Jupiter conjunction, they're all in a square to each other. They're just not sitting comfortably alongside each other. So again, I'm thinking about it as analogy here would be like of this kind of an example of this, let's say, would be somebody having a stressful time at work and then, a really difficult time at work. And then you go home at the weekend and then you really like splurge. And then you spend the whole weekend splurging and then go into work on Monday morning with a raging hangover. And then it's like you're not able to do your job at all. And then it's just adding to the problem. This is squares. It's like they don't sit alongside each other really well. So this is the potential in August. We have to be mindful again of this sort of like overindulgence because of the stress and the tension that we're feeling and try and mitigate that or ease that and making things actually worse. So as long as you're mindful of it, of course, then you're not going to fall into that trap and you're going to be able to use these transits for what they're best for, which is to get really focused and be open-minded about the outcome while having some enjoyments, whatever enjoyments that crop up to kind of alleviate that kind of tension. It's like kind of like work hard, play hard kind of situation in August, I would say. So then I want to talk about the moon and the sun joining for the new moon in Leo. So the sun moves into Leo mid-August, as it does every year. No different this year, except this year it's meeting with Ketu, the south node of the moon, the southern eclipse point. So although I said there's an eclipse going on in September, the fact that the sun joins the south node by middle of August is triggering it already. And that new moon on August 23rd is a trigger. It's not an eclipse, even though the sun and moon and Ketu are all together in the sign, but it's going to feel like one. It's likely to feel like an eclipse, like something's getting triggered here, something's being revealed. Ketu reveals things. It dredges up things many times from the past to reveal them. But I do want to say as well, it also conceals things. And as many things that might be revealed at this time, and alongside the sort of, the Leo type of story and those leaders and politicians and celebrities and all of these things and all of these scandals that have been dredged up now, we can see all of that happening. But at the same time, there's as many things that are revealed are also concealed. That's the nature of the shadow of Ketu. But with this new moon around August 23rd, I think things will be revealed. Ultimately, I think some leader is going to be taken out of power because of these things, or, more scandals revealed to the point where it's like you just can't avoid it anymore. And I think that's likely in the next year. And of course, Ketu is in Leo until the end of next year. But what I do find so interesting, though, is that there are no solar eclipses in Leo this year or next year, despite Ketu moving through Leo. No solar eclipses. So it's bypassing it this time because in September, the sun will have moved into Sidereal Virgo by the eclipse on the 21st of September. Even though Ketu's in Leo, it's a partial solar. And next year, the sun will still be in Cancer, while Ketu has moved all the way back to the beginning of Leo. So it's a solar eclipse, it's a total solar eclipse as well, but they're in different signs. So somehow Leo is escaping a solar eclipse. I don't know if that means that some leader will escape the worst of what Ketu can do, which is basically again like remove them completely. But I do think that there's going to be a lot more revealed. I don't think you can bypass that. So that's Sun moving into Leo and again triggering an eclipse already in a way and that new moon on the 23rd. Just before that new moon as well, just to mention that Venus moves into Cancer. So breaks up with Jupiter and then moves into Cancer and then opposes Pluto, as did the Sun and Mercury. And now we have more oppositions going on. So we have the opposition again of Saturn and Mars and that tension. Now we have the oppositions between Cancer and Capricorn, between Sun, Mercury, and now Venus and Pluto opposite. Pluto opposite planets tends to bring in some power struggle for sure. Sun, Pluto, especially in terms of governments and leaders. Mercury and Venus, is a power struggle in relationships and in trade and all of that, more especially. But I think that the biggest thing about this is this need to sort of have our safety net with Cancer and then typically project our shadow onto Pluto in Capricorn and to the big bad world out there essentially. And this is another side to the oppositions of planets in signs where you have these two extremes. Like you're focusing on one thing with the planet in Cancer, and then you're likely to push away the other thing on the opposite side of things. It's like typical example is you go on holiday with Cancer and you don't want to deal with work. But again, just generally, I would say with all these planets in Cancer in August, there's this need to sort of like have this safety net around us, have this kind of comfort and security around us, and then again project our shadow onto the world out there, the big bad world out there that's going through so many challenges at this time. So that's another thing to be mindful of in terms of oppositions in August, which are again there. So that is a brief sort of synopsis of what's going on in August. Again, if you'd like to join me on Patreon, I go through more in-depth astrology with a written report and sign-by-sign forecasts, and I have monthly and mid-monthly updates as well as weekly reports. So you can join me for just $5 a month at patreon.com/timeline astrology. And for now, I hope you have a great month, and until next time.